It gives me great pleasure to introduce Justin Urquhart-Stewart, co-founder of Seven Investment Management and chair of Regionally, the investment platform. And Justin's going to be talking about the shattering of global complacency.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Right. Nearly afternoon, everybody. Very nearly. But anyway, I've got far too many slides, so I apologise. I hope we'll have some time for questions, but we'll see how it goes on. During the course of my talk, I normally end up being rather rude about various countries, so if I'm personally offending you, I probably won't apologise. If there are any countries you want me to be particularly offensive about, I can try and do that as well. But I think it's fascinating. Whatever you think of Mr. Trump, he has been fantastic at actually breaking up the complacency. It is fascinating, isn't it? In any one time of life, you think, actually, we've evolved to such a level, we are now the peak of efficiency, the peak of the economy, and we're running it all so well. But of course, we're not. Actually, the problems have been lurking there the entire time. But we have been complacent. Complacent over, well, whether it's Russia or all sorts of other areas, which is a very good excuse for them people to sit there and say, well, I don't know what to do, in which case I'll do nothing, which is absolutely ridiculous. So a quick whiz round all of these sort of things. The backdrop to what's going on, you know most of this anyway, how the issues that obviously NATO are there, but the EU itself, looking pretty riven. Who runs it? No one's totally sure. So whether you're a Remainer or not is almost beside the point. We are where we are. What we do have to do is make sure we have, considering we're sitting next to the world's largest free trading area, and we don't seem to have an agreement with it. But that's another issue. For those of a certain age, going back to Bretton Woods after the Second World War, that, of course, was the restructuring of the gold standard and things like that. This is going to set us up for the future of financial structures. And, of course, that is now coming under pressure. Bretton Woods, part of it has already been revoked. There's going to have to be something to change all of this. And also, in my lifetime, when you actually find yourself, well, good days, was it? When you had the Tories, you had Labour, and then you had the Liberals, who just did something strange with animals. And now, of course, we've got Reform, and Reform actually upsets the Labour Party as it does as much the Tories, because they are actually just acting as this anger management corner, but attracting an awful lot of attention. And of course, that's easy to do if you don't have any responsibility at the moment. But again, it's meant that everything we've been brought up in British politics has changed, really rather radically. The background to all of this and things that are changing overall, tariff chaos, who would have thought that a couple of years back? And what effects it's having? Well, of course, Trump's got money coming in, because that's only the first part of it. When you actually you adjust the tariffs, what happens on the other side when they start changing tariffs? Not immediately, but thereafter. The trouble with tariff structures like this is not just putting a brake on the economy. In certain areas, it will break the economy unless you're careful. So Trump was actually right to actually question all of this. But the trouble is his knowledge doesn't actually stretch very far. It's all very well doing the first stage of it. Anyway. Currencies, again, when you actually sit there, go back 30 years ago and talk about cryptocurrency, well, you might as well deal with monopoly money. And yet it's there. We can all sit there and say, yes, but it's not proper money and all that. Those are all perfectly valid things you can argue about. But we're living with it. And living with it, and it's fascinating that you see a generation coming through, and I'm delighted to say several sort of godchildren and others, who've taken to this like a duck to water and paid off their university fees, which is quite remarkable. The problem is they now think that's investing, whereas probably most of the time it bears more resemblance to going to the horse racing, which for most people probably is a better idea than trying to follow crypto the entire time. There be dragons here, be careful. So all of the whole technical issues around this is all changing. There is nothing new about change. It's a constant when you have a constant change. And so therefore your investing and your attitude to investing, your attitude to risk will adjust and change as well. But certainly one of the things I find when you're talking to students or just as much the parents is having understanding that making money in investing takes time. If you want to have a bet, go to the horse racing. If you actually want to build money over time, it's not having to listen to the silly gits in red braces telling you what to do. Of course, one of the key areas is actually the boring element, compounding over time. Compounding over years and years. So if we actually made sure, for instance, children at the age of 0 had investments, well, they were doing much of the investments themselves, that the family does, and then working out how much you double your money every 10 years, by the time you do get to 60, 70, 80, that's now a reasonable sum of money without having to put any more into it. Why? Because the dullness of compounding. But anyway. Right, so other background risks. I don't need to go all of this. We all know the horrors of what you're seeing in Ukraine and other areas. But we should also look at some other areas of risk which people don't often talk about as well. And of course, the climatic issues. You don't have to stand outside now. Actually, very strange. My wife and I were up in Shetland the other day, and it was fascinating. Shetland, it's constantly stormy weather, and it's absolutely atrocious. And it was like a lovely summer's day. It was like a billiard table in terms of it, and it was actually hot. And speaking of Scots, actually, Scots and heat don't go down very well. Definite use of more soap is required there. Anyway, that's another problem. Right, swiftly around the world. The States. Is this? They always have this lovely idea. The economy. Is it now finally coming to an end? Is it actually going to make doom and disaster? I've found actually most of the time when I'm actually not investing, then I find myself not, in a position where you're trying to time the market, and it's incredibly difficult. Again, one of those annoying little city phrases, isn't it? Timing the market. It's time in the market, and it is maybe sound a bit trite, but it's true. And really, we see now with Trump. Is this how you run this economy, how you develop it? Short term, yes. Medium term, in terms of managing that debt as well. And some of the local figures we've coming out is showing this economy slowing up. Now, what's the key measure for Americans in terms of slowing up the markets? And the answer is here. Mr. and Mrs. Joe Schmo living in Little Rock, Arkansas, with their house and shopping in Walmart. They make up roughly 65% of the American economy. So if Joe Schmo's got a problem, you'll know about it quite quickly. And it was fascinating during the banking crisis in 2008, how quickly that was put through the system. And the Americans took action, and we did nothing in comparison to that. I know Gordon said he saved the world, but that's what happens if you come from Kirkcaldy. And the point really with here is they had identified, get the banking system working correctly. And you remember they'd actually reformed the banking system by revoking the laws that were organized in the 30s after the slump and the crash then. So that investment banking did not get mixed up with retail banking or more commercial side. They're two totally different pieces. You put them together, one eats the other. And you see, particularly in Britain, we were actually astonishing at some of these things when we had some of you, I'm sure, will go back to the joys of Big Bang. Big Bang is not an evening with Paris Hilton, but actually in terms of changing the way we were doing business. And of course, the city in those days was very strange, wasn't it? It was obviously monoculture in terms of white, monoculture in terms of men. I remember when the first ladies were allowed onto the floor. Frankly, it was disgusting, the behaviour of those yobs on the floor. So I find it fascinating how much this has now changed for the good. So actually go back to Joe Schmo. Get Joe Schmo confidence again, and give him confidence, and he starts spending, or she starts spending. So you get the banking and the housing market moving, more mortgages happening. Because the great thing about moving house, it's a great multiplier. Because you change house, what happens? The kitchen goes, the bathroom goes, children get, well, maybe not the children, but we'll be spending a lot of money. And the government earns more money out of that in terms of VAT. So it's a great multiplier. So quite correctly, the regulators focus on this, get the banks sorted out properly, and some will have to go to the wall, and hard luck, some of you are going to be losing money on it, the big investors on it. But it operated well. And yet here we are, only a few months after we finally sold back at a handsome loss the remnants of RBS. So I'm afraid if the issues when you look back at Britain and say, how could we be so stupid? Well, you can add that to the long list of gone with Gordon Brown selling the gold price, a price which was ludicrously low even in those days. The most important relationship, economic relationship in the world, and we can argue about this till the cows come home, is frankly this, China and America. Why do they need each other? Because they're in a symbiotic relationship with one another. They can't do without each other. Who owns the largest holder of American debt? Well, sometimes it's Japan, but most of the time, actually, it's China. They're the ones who've been buying the debt, so they hold a significant proportion of it. And then who's China's major trading partner? And of course, it's the US. So they may bitch and moan at one another, but they need each other. And so this is where we hope that actually logic will actually come through. With Trump and logic necessarily isn't the case. And be wary of what the Chinese are doing. They have longer memories. But nonetheless, This is the key relationship for both, for those two countries, and frankly for the rest of us. We need to make that operate. The Chinese are nothing if not practical and understanding that actually starting another war just for the sake of it is not a good idea. Depends what they do with Taiwan, I suppose. But nonetheless, that pragmatism means that they are much more likely to try and do deals with America rather than just being more awkward about it. But the information we get on China these days, I have to say, is a bit skewed one way. We obviously had an issue with, in terms of the basic demographics, they're running out of men. So you need more. Why? What's been happening? Well, of course, remember for years you had one child, one family, and for reasons you really don't want to go into, mostly boys. And the girls didn't survive. So you have this huge demographic difference. And of course, also, you have the issue of actually we look upon China as one big country. That's probably not what the Tibetans see it as, or some of the others at local groups. But nonetheless, the issues, you need to look underneath what's happening here. Remember, this is a centrally run economy. Companies don't go bust without the Communist Party saying so. And they do have that economy, and I find it actually more frightening when people talk about whether we have identity cards or not in this country. Well, we do, they're known as credit cards. But in China, the control and your behavior in society, whether it's at home, whether it's in work, or what you've been saying, will impact your ability to buy railway tickets. So more control on that. To be able to get your child to go on to the next stage of education, you're blocked. Why is your child thick? Well, that's my personal problem, but that's another one. But is your child actually in a position has not been behaving well, or you haven't been behaving well, that child can't go to the university. Over 3,000 major social riots last year, which were covered barely at all in this country. So all is not quite what it seems. And of course, a big issue between those who are in the big cities as opposed to those in the countryside who have to come to the countryside, go and get their work in Shanghai and come back only on holidays, rarely. And not so unsurprisingly, the attitude between these two groups of people is pretty drastic. And again, you go back to some of those riots and issues there. So there are all sorts of concerns here. Bear in mind, the size of this economy. It is worth actually noting when people say that China will be the largest economy, but just put it in perspective. Take the overall value of an economy and divide it by its population. And in America, so therefore, how much does Joe Schmo actually own of America? If you divide it up by the value by the population, the answer is about $54,000. Do the same with China, $3,000. So to actually say that the financial base you're dealing with here, it's a very different structure altogether on this. And one of the key issues, again, which pops up over from time to time, the property bubbles they put in there. The taxation system positively encourage more money going to property and to areas, if you've ever been to any of the sort of sites there to see the property developments, they are staggering. One of the most concerning things I came across was actually how they said they went to Singapore to see how we could actually make sure we got flats like the Singaporeans have. Singapore is on the equator. Shanghai isn't. So therefore, using that style of building and those methods, frankly, doesn't work very well. A slight problem they've got is the numbers seem to be falling down. So the other issue, of course, with China is its neighborhood. Because actually people get rather concerned as to what's happening. Take, for example, the red dot line, which was a map that turned up at the end of the Second World War that no one had ever seen before, which was the basis for saying, as China, we now have economic claims to actually virtue of this going right the way. The red dot line was down here, and then you go 200 miles beyond that as well. And you managed to piss off, sorry, a technical term, Vietnam, Philippines, Taiwan, well, they are anyway, and Brunei, Malaysia. So that's a fair number to be able to, and of course, Philippines. So you upset all those countries. But on the other hand, what are you going to do? If you're Malaysia and you're up against China, are you going to argue with the dragon? And so it's fascinating to see how this happens. And of course, this is actually down to the shoals here, which is all to do with oil and gas. So watch more on that. You've seen the pictures of the Chinese building now runways on these old coral areas. So it is fascinating to see. And actually, my sort of half-brother actually has a house dare I say, have an island. It's not that smart. There are an awful lot of islands in Indonesia, and they're not always worth a great deal. Anyway, he's built up a delightful sort of hotel area, but it's all very green, and it's actually done as a proper reserve to develop it. Anyway, it's just right down here. It's called Bawa. This is way beyond the red dot line, but he's surprised by the number of times the Chinese Navy is lurking around here, again, looking for other areas that they can not necessarily have for themselves, but make sure that people they're connected with will give them access to it, or make sure their allies are in the right position. Yet, of course, you've got the East China Sea as well. Here you're dealing with something which is a bit more difficult. This is the Japanese and the Chinese. And the papers always say this is about oil and gas. No, it's not. No, it's actually much more important to that. That is, of course, in the Far East, it is face, pride, personal pride. And why is this important here? Well, because as far as the Chinese are concerned, the Japanese seem to have forgotten one word which is really rather vital, which is, sorry, they have long memories of what happened at Nanking and things like that. The Japanese Prime Minister knows exactly what he's doing when he turns up the war shrine every year. To celebrate the dead, including those who should have been killed earlier. But nonetheless, he knows what he's doing. He's stamping on the dragon's tail. And you can always know that's actually not going to end up well. So these issues, and you can go around actually a whole area around China, where you've got actually Assam in northeast India, where there's still border disputes there, lobbing artillery shells at one another from time to time. Kashmir, of course, is an Indian-Pakistan problem, isn't it? Well, yeah, but not completely, because 20% of Kashmir was taken by the Chinese. A direct translation of their authority to actually control this part of Kashmir was that we should be protecting and looking after the community. Right, okay. So I suspect the Tibetans give them a good idea as to actually what that means. So be wary, we've got these issues going around. One particular element, you can see it in Africa. China pushing like mad to get more investment around the world. And I noticed this particularly in Uganda, one of my old hunting grounds. You could see there a few years back, the Chinese were investing, and they did so very effectively. The first group were coming in. They don't just speak Swahili. They've actually got the local patois as well, and they ingratiate themselves to be able to invest in the country. Countries will obviously say, yes, thank you very much, please do so. But please also look at the small numbers at the bottom of the contract as to what happens if you don't pay it all back on time at those rates. And so what you found here is that in Africa now, and I have one very senior person over there who's interested in further oil development and investment money, said, Justin, can we arrange some of this? And by the way, no Chinese money. Don't want to have anything more to do with that. A good example is actually down in Sri Lanka. I don't know if you've been to Sri Lanka, a stunning place that it is. But the bottom right-hand corner of Sri Lanka, not much goes on. A couple of rather bored elephants wandering around, but it's hardly strategic. And the Chinese came along and said, what you need is a port here to service this economic centre. I said, good. Where's the economic centre? Well, don't worry about that. Have the port, the economic centre can come along later. Oh, by the way, we'll give you the money for the port, as long as you pay it back on time, otherwise the rates go up and up and up and up. And being Sri Lanka, of course, that's exactly what happened. They didn't pay their money back, and the rates have gone up and up. And who now owns this particular, really rather significant port in Sri Lanka? The port of Shanghai. Starting to actually lay claim to this. So the second wave of Chinese go into Uganda or elsewhere, and this lot are actually rather different. They don't know the patois. Still perfect nice. The third wave come in, Chinatown. Oh, by the way, no blacks. And you think, am I being rude and offensive to that? Probably. But that's actually what you hear. The Chinese have to learn, a bit as the British did, and the Americans, that you can't just go in and lord it over places because, funnily enough, people don't like that sort of thing. So be rather wary with it. So my point of this is China has got disputes around the world, but as far as they're concerned, it's a strategic development for them to be able to make sure that they've got power and control in key areas. They don't need to own it all, just make sure they've got enough influence, which is not surprising. And remember, China's got a long memory. You think about all those countries. Remember sometimes the awful thing with Colombia and countries like these? These are narco countries because they produce opium and sell it. Who would do that? Britain. We actually had 2 opium wars, not to actually stop opium being traded, but to ensure that the Chinese not only imported it, but was bought from us at a higher price. And people do remember that. So all these things, I think, work for constant analysis. That does not mean the end of the world because we're having border disputes the entire time. It's a constant. What you have to work out is when does it cross a line from being a constant into, whoa, this is now getting dangerous. Cite Ukraine. What happens when you push an unpleasant Russian bear into a corner? At what stage does he decide to lob in a tactical nuclear weapon of some kind? It doesn't have to be very big, but it crosses a line. As the EU, as I was saying earlier, it's the position here who actually is running the EU. Unfortunately, dear lady, nice she is such in her position, but not well known for her organizational skills, certainly when dealing with some of the German defense industries, where about 8 years ago, the Germans did a test and worked out they had 8 working tanks. So I'm afraid she's never seen as the most dynamic individual. And of course, the problem with it, it's all growing in the EU, but also the euro currency. What's going to happen to that? Can that survive? In my view, no. It's going to die. When? I have no idea. It'll still be there. It'll still be there whilst the politicians still want it. When the politicians don't want it anymore, it'll fall apart. You cannot have a fiscal tax system which does not fit into how you're actually operating your currency as well. It will come to grief. Thank heaven we never joined it because it's caused really very great difficulties. And when you see the issue of what happened in Greece, the Greeks, the Germans always go on about the Greeks never paying any tax. They've never paid any tax. What I always loved various tax breaks the Greeks managed to come up with. If you were a barber in Greece, you were able to retire at 45. Very good. I know they're hairy people, but nonetheless, you can't be that worn out. Mind you, given the number of Turkish barbers we've got in London now, it does seem really odd. So what happens with the euro then? What should you have done with it? Well, the actual simplest way of doing it is actually what happened in South Africa. 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Then also in Belgium, a bit further back, that you split the currency. And split the currency on the basis that you've actually got a domestic currency and you've got your external debt, which is in euros. The domestic currency will plummet, but it gets the economy moving again. Meanwhile, you can still service the other currency, the external debt, and keep that going. That keeps the party going. And that was the view that Mrs. Merkel was dealing with. Of course, it's now a great shame. You can no longer use that lovely joke, but forgive me, I want to use it anyway, is when Mrs. Merkel turns up at Athens airport and he would sit there and they say, what's your occupation, madam? And she said, no, not this time. So the euro itself, when you see the future of it, I do find it very strange. Who would actually qualify for membership of the euro according to the original definitions? The answer is, well, no one really, probably not even Germany. So we do find it really, really rather odd indeed. It's interesting to see then how these are going to develop and where it does finally split apart. Politically, you can see the splits occurring, after all, whether you're dealing with Slovakia and also Hungary, who are much happier to be dealing with Russia than the rest of the EU are. That is not one solid group. And it's an expensive solid group. The graph on the asset, you can see the difference in GDP per capita. The US herring away and the EU not. Right, Russia, let's be clear, Russia is not a superpower. Russia is a dangerous power. They ain't a superpower. By the way, in terms of calculation, when you say, go back where I said that $54,000 was the value to every Joe Schmo of the American economy, in Russia, actually, that works about $8,000. The country has, doing its best to try and actually sell anything it can at any price. Of course, when Putin originally came in, he was going to broaden out the economy to make sure it wasn't dependent upon minerals and oil and other such elements and commodities. As a result of which, with all his periods of running this place, along with his lapdog Medvedev, they've concentrated even more on commodities. They've narrowed it. And so they find themselves in a position, they haven't got the cash. We know they haven't got a lot of cash because we got it. Why? Because London, of course, was one thing we were really, really good at, even in the worst of times, and that was money laundering. If you want to actually try to open a bank account for your child these days, you probably have to leave the child in as a deposit. But it's incredibly difficult. You want to actually go and borrow a huge sum of money from a suspected oligarch from Russia, apparently no problems at all. I'm being facetious, but even so, this is still carrying on. So be wary with all of this. So Russia will find itself in a position where it's costing itself, this war is costing a fortune. But now you're dealing with face. To what extent does Putin actually sit there and say, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to do that. Should have turned right, not left. So what's going to happen? Do you hope that actually there's going to be a friendly oligarch who's going to knock him on the head? Well, we won't be the first people to have thought of that. He would have thought of that and make sure anybody who's getting close to being a tiresome oligarch is liable to find themselves having problems with the window on the 6th floor. So be really rather wary. Also, of course, it's got population numbers are actually falling dramatically, no, numbers falling off a cliff, some being pushed off a cliff. You can actually now get, if you really want it, current citizenship in Russia, where you'll even get subsidies to become Russian. I'm not sure if we'll all be rushing to go and do that, but I think. The effects of all this, we know, you'll see them the whole time. What it's meaning, of course, is actually in terms of investing opportunities for us. If you're just being totally cold-blooded about it, it wouldn't have taken a great mind to actually work out how much defense and defense-related elements are going to benefit from it, and they have. And you'll see that further happening. Just go through the areas, follow the line, follow the money, and where it's going, where the trade's going, and these are throwing up significant opportunities, which is an awful thing to say when you're talking about people being killed. But that is the case. So the issue now is that for Russia, will Trump actually start imposing secondary tariff controls, to dissuade the Chinese and Indians from buying cheap Russian oil? Well, whether they agree it or not, it ain't going to stop. It'll still be carrying on. Russia will make sure that even if it's sun money, you'll get it coming on. If we tend to somehow ignore India, we have sometimes rather patronizing attitude to it. Just remember one number. 5. Last year, the United Kingdom was the 5th largest economy in the world. This year, we're the 6th, because it's now India's the 5th. Hardly surprising, really. And it is the border issues I've talked about overall, but actually what you've seen is greater domestic investment being applied, and we're not talking about cheap accounting services and things like that, far more effective. And of course, reversing the investment processes we've been using when you actually look at who owns key elements of British industry. So it's fascinating to see how this is actually going to develop further. Yes, there are key issues there in terms of the inefficiency of the economy, and also you've got the Naxalites, which doesn't get much coverage over here in central India, which are the more extreme version of some of the communists there. But nonetheless, this has still been growing. And of course, one of the key elements of India, unlike China, it has a legal system we sort of understand. It is, yes, of course there's corruption, but there's a better rule of law there than the cloak and dagger that you'll get in China. So, not surprisingly, it's attracting more money coming into it. And also, again, follow that money coming out as wealthy money goes to find other things to invest in. 2 other areas to briefly mention. Japan, as a long story, you're all familiar with that, the aging population. In fact, the aging bubble's actually sort of coming to end. It's on the other side of it now. It's the Americans who've now got that bigger issue on that. But nonetheless, what you've had here with Japan, where does the growth come from? It's running out of workers, and needs more people do it. The trouble is, Japanese aren't very good about having foreigners coming and working there, especially if they're Korean. So it is an area where, remarkably, we're still seeing growth. But this is a country that's almost been running as a sort of contrarian ways that you find other economies working. So it's going to continue operating quite successfully. It's still actually finding itself in a position where it is actually growing slowly but effectively. And bear in mind, you're never going to get really higher levels of growth at the moment, because where's that demand going to be coming from? So don't ignore Japan. It's a key element. Maybe you're investing in the effect of Japan and what it needs to develop. More to my part of the world, some of my family come from, is ASEAN. And this is an area where you can see now really dramatic changes. The rise of the Oriental middle class, known as my daughter, armed with a credit card, probably mine. So you go to Jakarta, oh God, 20 years ago, 5 or 6 shopping malls, sort of Westfield-type shopping malls. Last time I was there, we were talking about over 70 of these things. So it's become part of the culture to go in, and the entire family goes and takes over a coffee shop, a Starbucks, and it's all carefully regimented. The mamas, the senior members of the family, not the men, and they'll be seated at the back. And the further forward you are, the more junior you are. And it's almost like it's a rather hot version, Oriental version of Bath during the days of Jane Austen. Because effectively what you do is sort of would-be couples marching up and down the shopping mall in front of parents and grandparents and prospective in-laws to get their approval. It's a fascinating piece of culture, which has just purely happened to develop there. What it means, though, is that you're seeing the rise of the middle class and their spending. Now, Singapore's a bit of an outlier here because remember, Singapore sounds the Isle of Wight, but nonetheless very powerful in terms of financial position, but nonetheless very small with some bigger neighbours who are very keen to make sure it doesn't get away with everything. Malaysia still growing, it's got other domestic issues, but overall that economy has been in better shape. Philippines has always been the weaker end of it, but again, you're still seeing more of that growth. A lot of these countries, you will see that the issues of corruption are still there. That's always going to be the case. But regulation is catching up. I've always admired, actually, the Singaporeans in terms of their politicians. And you always hear the question over here, how much should our politicians be paid? They're paid far too much. Actually, they're paid far too little. The Singaporeans pay their Prime Minister a huge amount of money on the basis that actually he's not going to have any other jobs because he doesn't need to. And the same with the ministers. Mind you, if they cock up, then they're out pretty quickly. But nonetheless, it's something people will aspire to go and join in and be involved in. So ASEAN, despite the other warriors in the rest of the world, there's some key areas there, countries and also the individuals in terms of companies. You have to do your research in that, but be wary of markets in these areas because they're not very liquid. The information and data is often untrue. So be very careful. I've seen some really fantastic star fund managers in the past, like Mr. Anthony Bolton a few years back, who was great in the UK with his income fund, fantastic. He retired, and then someone said, no, come on, what do you want to do, Fidelity? We need you to run China. Go and run that fund. It doesn't know anything about China. Oh, no, we'll give you people to do that. And of course, it was a complete dog's breakfast. And a great shame, but it was talked into it as what to do. As for Blighty, well, the whole time you have to sort of be careful because we really do talk ourselves into doom and gloom at every single opportunity. And you have to sort of, if you're doing radio and television interviews, you've got to make it credible. But it's easier to actually sit there and just say, oh, all these things going on. We have some positive areas. Where? Well, they're actually all over the country. What a key area? The technology hubs around some of the main universities. And not London-based ones, but all over the place. And of course, once you've got a hub, they start breeding. And so that's why you have things like Silicon Gorge, which is Bristol, and Silicon Fen, Silicon Glens, Silicon Implant. No, that's not right. This is where you'll see them. The problem is, when they start up, that's okay. How do they grow? We don't have an effective market for small companies in this country. You say, what about AIM? Yeah, what about AIM? A group of us started AIM in Glasgow. Why? Because Glasgow had a stock exchange, and well, after the war, we had about 45 stock exchanges in this country. Ridiculous. You don't need any more silly gits and red braces from stock exchanges telling you what to do. But there were 7 which were actually operating, and the primary purpose of the stock exchange is not to buy and sell shares, it is to raise capital for the businesses in that area in the most cost-effective and controlled manner. Our current stock exchange doesn't do that. Its owner, the stock exchange, as far as I'm concerned, is barely over 10% of their turnover. So it's almost irrelevant. Yet this is a strategic part of our economy. If you have mechanisms to raise capital and pump that in through, frankly, I would fire the stock exchange, start again. And you need a smaller companies market. Why? Because we're very good at setting up smaller companies. Well, it's actually quite difficult to think about setting up a large company. But anyway, but we set up, even last year, it was about 4,500. But for several years in a row, we were setting up more companies in this country than Germany and France put together. Now, it's a high death rate. But what it meant was, though, actually you had companies being developed and attracting investment. Now you need to go to the growth sector. Where's the next stage? And that's when we fall down. And that's when the joys of private equity start coming in. And of course, private equity will sit there and say, well, no, we're not short term. No, it's 3 years, but we'll go to 5. Yes, if you cocked it up. Good investing in businesses like that. If you're running a business, you're not planning for 3 years. I'm planning over 10 years, 15 years, and I want investors in my company who are going to have the same view as me. So that's where we need to have more innovation here, and something we're certainly pressing for to happen. More regional investment to be put through all of that. So don't necessarily just write everything off and say it's doom and gloom. We've got some idiotic things as we had over HS2, but actually if you look at the elements in terms of putting in high-speed fibre and the impact that has very quickly indeed. If you go down to Cornwall, delightful place, there's St Ives, beautiful, absolutely lovely. On the other side of the estuary is a place called Hell, and actually probably it's Hell, but driving. It's an ugly little place with a very nasty little industrial unit there. But with businesses, using the high-speed fibre, which the EU put in just before we left, you've got businesses there which are operating out of Chicago, more point, operating out of Hoyle into Chicago, with online view of, in this particular case, drilling bits. And as the drilling bits are wearing out, they can see that, they can have them remade overnight, and a 3D printer puts the packaging together, which has to be very delicate, and it's off the following morning. And that couldn't have happened 20 years ago. May not be the most efficient way of doing it, but it just shows the power of that and how that's changing. So the power of that proper mechanism for bringing more money and communication together is much more important than HS2. There's a lovely argument with some of the politicians at HS2. Actually, let's connect London up with Birmingham and Manchester. What, again? Get 10 minutes off the route. It's irrelevant. If you really want to get more bang for your buck, you don't go north-south, you go east-west. Join up the conurbations. Basic maths will tell you that you have the economies of scale. Actually, create that. So, just 3 numbers to remember for the UK. 6. We are the world's 6th largest economy still. But to listen to the BBC half the time, you think we are doomed. We don't make anything anymore. Quite right. Well, we still make things, not as much as before. We're the world's 9th largest manufacturer. You may wonder what. And then also as exporter, not as high as anywhere near we used to be. We're still the 14th largest exporter. The banks have just walked away from that and left it mostly to the chambers of commerce to try and deal with absolutely riveting things such as export dockets and things like that. That's proper trade, which unfortunately the current generation of bankers we're dealing with do not understand. Internal threats, I'm not going to spend too much time going through all of this, but you'll be familiar with things that we've all had to do with cybersecurity. My wife at the back there had to deal with me yesterday trying to deal with yet another scam going through. Luckily, she was there to save me from it. Anyway, she wears a better dress than I do. It doesn't fit me. As for negative issues we've got to deal with, well, we're actually running out of people. It'd be quite helpful. Rachel from accounts really doesn't get it at all. We need more people paying tax. How do you do that? Well, tax them more. Really? Actually, what you do is you actually create the mechanism whereby more people are working and therefore paying tax. Or how about getting rid of something like stamp duty? It doesn't actually raise a great deal of money. But as I said when it came to Joe Schmo, if you're buying and selling a house, what's going to be happening? You're spending more money on that and getting VAT out. That's how you get more money coming through. The key word in any of this is confidence. That's what our government needs to be able to do. Currently, it doesn't inspire confidence with its own membership, let alone the rest of the country. So it's rather strange. And the cost of debt, I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because it's rather tedious, but these are different areas of expenditure. Social protection, 370 billion, health, 250 billion, education, debt interest, 109 billion. 109. 3 years ago, that was 50 billion. It's interesting, though, when you see who actually owns this debt. Actually, what you'll find with the debt is about just over a quarter of that debt is actually owned by us. Brilliant. Called quantitative easing. You go back to an economics book 30 years ago, it didn't exist. But the ability to be able to print more money, to be able to have this, effectively what it's doing, create a gilt through the Bank of England, and the gilt is then purchased, and lo and behold, you've got money created. Brilliant. This was the money tree. However, life gets rather difficult if you just have this debt keep on more and more, and you're paying more interest. What it does mean, though, is that twice a year the government gets a coupon, dividend, of roughly 20 billion. That's quite nice. Have your own debt and pay yourself the dividend on it. You couldn't make this up, could you? But it happens to be true. I'm going to go through all of these now, and all of those elements. I love this one. It's this from my old business. And don't worry about the dates. I just highlight here when you're trying to work out what to invest in. And you have to have broad asset allocation, as opposed to actually sit there. I'm betting on, well, Japan is the future. Japan down there, it's got to get better from here, hasn't it? Yes, it's got to be better here. And look, up here, Japan, look, second, it's brilliant. Buy Japan. Bugger. Bugger. Well, it's not going anywhere. Well, it's a bit of recovery here. Well, sod Japan. Oh, bugger. This year's fashion fad is next year's tank top. And so be rather wary of what you're dealing with here. And it's very trite to say, we have a blend of them all. But if you do have a blend of them all, funny enough, you see a sort of mark running through the middle here. You can start improving the returns. People are gathering around, so I shall shut up now very quickly indeed. The key for us all to do, no matter how good you are at buying and selling shares or anything like that, is actually financial family planning. Not family planning, you've gone past that bit now. Just try and make sure across the generations you've got great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, children, and great-grandparents. They should have gone by now. No, but they're still there. Where are the assets? Normally at the wrong level. Who's going to pay for the university fees? Who's my child ever going to be able to afford a house? The answer is, as an individual, can't. As a family, Scottish families used to do this the whole time. These days, a bit more fashionable, call them a family office, but you don't have to do that for millions of pounds. Family office is just a careful coordination where you can do that quite easily with your iPad. So with all of that, the message is simple, right? Doomed? No. Don't panic. Damaged? Yes, but not doomed. We can talk ourselves into a doom loop very easily, and the BBC do their best to try and do so. But it provides us with the opportunity to be able to look at it and see, actually, here are the growth areas, we can take advantage of it, not just domestically, but internationally as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I better shut now, because it's probably time for lunch, so I should be quiet. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Justin.